Hey guys, tonight we're stepping back in time into the world of 17th century English dinner parties. Picture this: a candle-lit dining room filled with laughter, the scent of roasting meats drifting through the air, and the sound of clinking goblets as a never-ending supply of wine is poured. But don't be fooled by the elegant settings. These parties weren't exactly your chill, cozy dinners. In fact, if you found yourself suddenly transported to one of these soirees, well, you probably wouldn't survive the social rules. There's no lying down in the middle of a meal, no texting under the table, and absolutely no slouching in your seat. It's a world where seating arrangements are a strategic move, and the food, well, let's just say it's nothing like the takeout you're used to. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, post your location and local time in the comments. I'd love to see where you're listening from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Dinner parties in 17th century England were more than just meals. They were events of grandeur, drama, and occasionally ridiculousness. People came to show off their wealth, their wit, and of course, their food. Imagine stepping into one of these grand halls where nobles and landowners would gather to feast, talk politics, and maybe, just maybe, forget their troubles for a few hours. But before we get too deep into the clinking of silverware and endless wine goblets, let's take a look at what it really meant to host a dinner party during this lavish era. So sit back, relax, and let's dive into the quirky rituals that made these dinner parties unforgettable. The first thing you'd notice at a 17th century English dinner party is the size of the dinner table. And no, we're not talking about some cozy, intimate dinner with just a handful of friends. These feasts were massive, almost theatrical in their scale. The dining rooms were often as grand as the banquets they hosted, with tables that stretched so long you'd think you were at a royal banquet hall. We're talking tables that could seat anywhere from 20 to 100 guests. And yes, that's right, 100 people, all crowded around a single table, carefully arranged like chess pieces. There was a certain level of strategy when it came to seating arrangements. The positioning at the table was a status game, a game you definitely didn't want to lose. The host, of course, took the place of honor at the head of the table, but the guests were carefully arranged according to their rank, wealth, and social connections. At these lavish events, seating arrangements weren't just about who you liked. It was about political power, alliances, and social climbing. This wasn't the place to sit next to your best friend. No, you'd be eyeing that spot next to the Duke, or that well-positioned seat near the richest widow in the room. The seating chart was a social map that could define your status for months. As you took your seat, you'd likely find yourself facing the finest china, crystal goblets, and all manner of silver utensils, each one polished to perfection. But this wasn't just for show. There was a whole etiquette to the table that could make or break your reputation. A single misstep, say, a clink of the glass too loud, or a wrong fork used, could be the subject of gossip for weeks. Everyone would be watching, and the pressure was on to perform your part. So, As you settle into your seat at this grand table, you can't help but wonder how long it would take before you're bombarded by the subtle and not so subtle pressures of these 17th century dinner rituals. Would you have the nerve to hold your own in a room full of people vying for social dominance? Or would you be one of the poor souls nervously eyeing the nearest servant, hoping they're the one who's going to fill your wine glass? Now that you're settled in at your appointed seat, we can't ignore the most striking feature of these dinner parties: the fashion. If you thought you were dressed up for a night out, you might want to reconsider. The 17th century was all about ostentation, and dinner parties were no exception. You see, these gatherings weren't just meals, they were a chance to flaunt your wealth, status, and, let's be honest, your fashion sense. And believe me, this wasn't the time for casual attire. As the guests trickled in, you'd immediately notice the elaborate gowns and extravagant coats. For men, it was all about long, elaborate wigs, velvet doublets, and fancy stockings that went on for miles. Women, well, they were often draped in layers of luxurious silks, with bodices so tight they could barely breathe. Don't even think about a comfy dinner. And the accessories, oh, the accessories. From gold chains to brooches to feathers and hats, it was a competition to see who could look the most lavish, the most high society. If you didn't arrive in your finest, you weren't even allowed in. But fashion wasn't just about looking pretty, it was about making an impression. Those who arrived dressed in the most elaborate, jaw dropping outfits would get the best spots at the table. It wasn't just the men competing for attention. The women made sure they showed up in stunning dresses, often flaunting the latest French or Italian fashion trends. To stand out, some even wore larger than life hats, adorned with jewels or feathers, which were more like mini celebrations perched on their heads. So, as you sit there, trying not to feel underdressed, imagine the sensory overload: the glittering jewel tones, the heavy perfumes that filled the air, and the constant sound of people adjusting their layers. This wasn't a quiet dinner, it was a sensory spectacle. The fashion was just the beginning of a very, very long evening. But before we dive into what they were actually eating, and trust me, it's as bizarre as the fashion, let's talk about the most important part: conversation. At a 17th century dinner party, conversation wasn't just idle chatter, it was a highly strategic performance. You couldn't simply talk about the weather or complain about your sore feet from standing in those ridiculous shoes. No, you had to engage in witty, intelligent, and often socially calculated conversation. But here's where it gets interesting. Historians still argue whether it was the conversation that was the true highlight of these events, or if it was the food itself that stole the show. But that's a conversation for later. For now, let's focus on what's coming next. The table's laden with food, and not just any food. We're talking about strange dishes that might make you question your own dinner preferences. As the conversation ebbs and flows around the table, the moment of truth arrives: the food. Now, if you thought your typical dinner party had an interesting food choices, hold on to your goblet. A 17th century English dinner party was a place to display not just your wealth and fashion, but your culinary prowess. And believe me, that often meant the most exotic, bizarre, and, at times, downright puzzling dishes made their way onto the table. First, let's start with what you would recognize: meats, meats, and more meats. The English were particularly fond of roasted beef, venison, and game birds. The idea was to overwhelm your senses with the richness of the food. But that's just the beginning. Think of the most extravagant, unexpected flavors you can imagine. Now imagine they were all served in a single meal. You'd find foods like whole swans, geese stuffed with peacock, or even pies filled with live birds that would flutter out when the crust was broken. Talk about dramatic. Historians still argue whether these extravagant meals were a sign of overindulgence or simply a way to show off one's power. But beyond the spectacle of the dishes, the question arises: was anyone really enjoying the food, or were they just enduring it for the sake of showing off their wealth and taste? You have to wonder, did the guests actually taste these odd creations, or just politely smile and swallow for the sake of social appearance? And it wasn't just about show-stopping meats. They took their vegetables just as seriously, though not always in ways we would recognize today. For example, the English loved a good turnip, so much so that they even made turnip pies. Some guests were also known to eat peas pudding, a mashed up dish that could either be sweetened or served savory, but always rich and filling. And then there were things like marchpane, a sugary treat made from almonds and sugar that looked like a miniature sculpture on the plate. But the truly bizarre things came in the form of sauces. Imagine eating a dish drenched in a sauce made from spices like cinnamon, cloves, and sugar, designed to coat the meat in an exotic, sweet, and spicy glaze. These sauces were meant to overwhelm the senses, and sometimes guests would get carried away with the mixture of flavors. It's hard to imagine the combination of a sweet sauce on a savory dish, but in the 17th century, that was exactly what some of the most gourmet dishes were all about. As you munch on your course, you notice that the conversation has shifted. No longer are people discussing the weather or the latest gossip. They're talking about the origins of the food on their plates. Some people even liked to share the story behind the dish, whether it was a recipe handed down by a family member or a culinary creation inspired by travels abroad. For some, these stories were as important as the food itself. After all, dinner parties weren't just about eating, they were an opportunity to showcase knowledge, culture, and, of course, a bit of theatrical flair. But now that we're all settled in with food and wine, we can't ignore the most crucial element of these parties: the drinks. As the rich flavors of meat and strange sauces settle in your stomach, it's time to focus on another integral part of the 17th century English dinner party: the drinks. If you've ever wondered how these guests made it through a multi course meal, the answer is simple: alcohol, and lots of it. You see, the 17th century had a very different relationship with drinking than we do today. It wasn't just something you sipped on socially or to wind down after a long day. No, it was an essential part of life. And at a dinner party, it was an absolute necessity. Let's begin with the drink of choice: wine. But not just any wine. Oh no, these were extravagant, imported wines: Spanish sherries, French clarets, and even wine from distant Italy. Some of these wines were rare and incredibly expensive, meant to impress both the guest and the host. Imagine sipping a glass of wine that quite literally cost more than your entire dinner bill today. But the truly fascinating part, wine wasn't always just wine. It was often mixed with spices, sugar, or fruit. You might find a punch bowl filled with a concoction of wine, spices like cinnamon and cloves, and sweeteners like honey. It was a strange blend of sweet and savory that would leave guests feeling both tipsy and slightly perplexed by the odd mix of flavors. Historians still argue whether the constant flow of wine was meant to loosen the tongues of the guests or simply to ensure that they didn't mind the questionable food being served. But one thing's for sure, these guests were drinking with gusto. The wine was often poured without hesitation, and the toasts, oh, the toasts, were frequent, sometimes happening after every course. In fact, a dinner party without a toast was practically unthinkable. Every occasion was an opportunity for someone to stand and make a toast, often to the health of the monarch, the host, or even a visiting noble. The guests would raise their glasses, clink them together, and recite a few well rehearsed lines before downing their drinks. And it wasn't just wine. Beer and ale were also common fixtures at these dinners. The working class might have been more familiar with beer, but at these high society events, it wasn't unusual to find the table laden with large mugs of dark ale, which was often enjoyed alongside the more refined wines. Some guests would alternate between the two, making the transition from wine to beer and back again with ease. But there was another drink that took center stage at these feasts, the infamous punch, a concoction of rum, brandy, or other spirits mixed with citrus fruits, sugar, and water. Punch was the 17th century equivalent of what we might consider a cocktail today. In fact, the very word punch is derived from the Hindi word panch, meaning five, referencing the five key ingredients traditionally used in the drink. Guests would sip on this potent brew throughout the night, and by the time the final course arrived, many would already be feeling the effects. It wasn't uncommon for guests to get a little too comfortable, slurring their words or leaning a bit too far into the table while engaging in passionate political debates, or perhaps just getting caught up in a friendly game of who can tell the best joke. But the drinking wasn't just about the alcohol, it was also about the ritual. The serving of drinks was carefully orchestrated, with servants coming around to fill glasses between courses, ensuring no one's goblet went empty for too long. It was the social glue that kept the dinner party alive, especially during the more awkward pauses in conversation. Imagine the steady stream of servants, the clink of goblets, and the shared laughter echoing around the room as guests exchanged stories, all while trying to outdo each other in wit and charm. As the wine continues to flow, the conversation turns from food and drink to something far more interesting, the evening's entertainment. As the evening progresses and the wine continues to flow, the energy in the room begins to shift. The laughter grows louder, the conversation livelier, and the occasional drunken snort or snicker can be heard amidst the din. But despite all this chaos, one thing remains constant: the need to entertain. Dinner parties were never just about eating and drinking, they were an opportunity to display wit, charm, and creativity. And as the meal nears its midpoint, the entertainment begins. Now, this isn't your standard, let's watch a movie and call it a night kind of entertainment. No, these were 17th century dinner parties, and guests were expected to contribute to the evening's amusement, whether they liked it or not. A dinner party was a showcase of your intellectual prowess, your musical ability, and, if you were truly bold, your theatrical flair. One popular form of entertainment was music. You'd probably hear a soft melody drifting in from a corner of the room where musicians played lutes, violins, or even harpsichords. For the more aristocratic gatherings, a full chamber orchestra might even be employed, providing a luxurious soundtrack to the evening. If you were lucky, you might even get a guest to break into song, serenading the group with a delicate aria or a popular ballad of the time. Imagine sitting there, listening to the haunting notes of a violin, while around you glasses clink and people engage in heady debates about politics, religion, or art. It's all part of the atmosphere, a constant reminder that dinner parties weren't just about food, they were cultural events designed to impress and entertain. But it wasn't just about passive enjoyment. Guests at 17th century dinner parties were also expected to actively participate in the entertainment. One common game was something bold, pass the parcel. You might think this sounds a bit too modern, but in the 1600s, it was a game where guests would take turns unwrapping layers of cloth or paper to reveal hidden objects, sometimes tiny trinkets or a particularly embarrassing note. The game was full of suspense, especially when the person unwrapping the final layer found themselves faced with a challenge or a peculiar task. Some of these challenges might have involved reciting a poem, telling a joke, or even performing a little dance. If you were feeling particularly bold, or perhaps tipsy from all the wine, you could end up doing something utterly ridiculous to entertain your fellow guests. Then there were the more theatrical performances. Some dinner parties included impromptu plays or readings from popular novels. Aristocrats often hired professional actors or even the occasional playwright to come and perform a short play for the guests. Others might indulge in elaborate recitations of famous poems or historical speeches, all designed to show off their education and literary knowledge. If you thought that these dinners were a quiet, reserved affair, think again. Instead, you're sitting in a room where everyone is trying to outshine each other with their creativity and sense of humor. The laughter is infectious, the drama high, and it's hard not to get swept up in the sheer theatricality of it all. But let's not forget about the most scandalous form of entertainment, perhaps the most controversial of all, the ever popular game of truth or dare, though back then it wasn't quite called that. Guests might take turns revealing deep secrets or challenging each other to perform outlandish acts, often under the influence of copious amounts of wine. Imagine being dared to sing loudly in front of the group or confess something deeply personal to the crowd. It was all in good fun, of course, but the games could also stir up tension, especially if someone took their performance too seriously or ended up making a fool of themselves. In these moments, the line between entertainment and embarrassment became deliciously blurred. And as the night winds on, one thing becomes clear. The dinner party isn't over yet. But with all this entertainment, the evening's flow naturally transitions toward the dessert courses, where even more strange and fascinating customs await. By now, the evening is well underway. The music has softened, the laughter has grown more relaxed, and the plates are gradually emptied. As the main courses fade into the background, it's time for the most anticipated part of any 17th century dinner party: dessert. But don't imagine the sweet pastries or cakes you might enjoy after dinner today. Oh no, dessert during this era was its own elaborate spectacle, a final flourish that could both dazzle and mystify guests, leaving them with an odd taste lingering long after the evening ended. As you settle in for the dessert course, it's important to note that this was not just about satisfying a sweet tooth. No, dessert was an opportunity to impress, to end the evening on a high note with something unexpected and show stopping. You might see the arrival of a marchpane, a confection made of almonds and sugar, which looked more like a sculpture than a snack. The marchpane might be shaped into intricate designs: flowers, animals, even entire miniature landscapes. At some parties, it was used to create astonishing, edible representations of famous landmarks or portraits of the host's family. Imagine sitting there, unable to take your eyes off the delicate figures, wondering how long it took to make these edible works of art. But marchpane wasn't the only dessert on offer. If the host was feeling particularly extravagant, the table might be graced with a grand centerpiece made of sugar, sometimes entire castles or animals made entirely of sugar paste, brightly colored and designed to leave guests in awe. Historians still argue whether these sugar sculptures were meant to show off the host's wealth and creativity, or if they were simply a bizarre fad of the time. What's clear is that these sugar creations were as much about spectacle as they were about taste, and the guests were expected to fawn over them. In some cases, these sugar sculptures were so intricate and detailed that they could be admired for hours before they were finally eaten, leaving guests questioning whether they should even eat them at all. And then there were the fruits. But not just any fruits. These were fruits often imported from far off places. Spices and tropical fruits, like oranges, figs, and pomegranates, made their way into the dessert spreads. But they weren't always served fresh. Many of these fruits were preserved, soaked in syrup or sugar to prolong their shelf life and impress guests with their unusual flavors. The idea was to showcase the host's ability to procure rare items and create something truly luxurious. If you weren't serving fruit soaked in syrup, you were expected to present it in a way that made it seem more valuable, like candied fruits or fruit stuffed pies. One of the more curious desserts was suckets, a type of confection that consisted of boiled sugar, nuts, and various spices. These treats were often served after the main courses, meant to freshen the palate, but they also served another, more significant purpose as a conversation starter. Picture this: guests sitting back in their chairs, lazily popping sugar coated nuts into their mouths while debating the most recent political scandal or discussing the latest fashion trends. The suckets were the perfect accompaniment to these lively, sometimes overindulgent discussions. But, as with everything at a 17th century dinner party, dessert wasn't just about eating. It was another opportunity for guests to showcase their sophistication and social standing. It was expected that they would talk about the food, the exotic fruits, the rare spices, and the artistic arrangements, and do so in a way that was both complimentary and refined. Guests were also expected to show restraint, to display their ability to savor every bite without devouring everything in front of them. Of course, this was easier said than done. After hours of heavy drinking and extravagant courses, but it was part of the grand performance. As the final course winds down, the conversation begins to take on a more relaxed tone. The wine is now being replaced with brandy or a final warm drink. The entertainment has slowed, and the guests are winding down, their bellies full, their minds a little hazy from the food and drink. But, like all good things, the dinner party must come to an end. However, not before one last round of toasts and farewells. It's not uncommon for the host to stand, raise their glass one final time, and thank everyone for their attendance. This could be an emotional moment, especially if the gathering had been a celebration of something important, like a birthday or a successful political alliance. And as you rise from your seat, perhaps a little unsteady from the wine, you can't help but think about how this dinner party, with all its quirks and eccentricities, was something far beyond just a meal. It was a display of power, wealth, and social skill, an intricate dance of politics and pleasure, all wrapped up in one night of excess and indulgence. But for now, the evening is winding down, and soon the lights will dim and the last guests will leave. It's time to reflect on the evening, to allow the conversations and the strange foods to settle into the background, and to prepare for the journey home. As the evening winds to a close, you may start to notice the subtle shift in the atmosphere. The excitement and revelry of the meal are beginning to fade, and the conversation has turned softer, almost introspective. But that doesn't mean the party's over. At a 17th century dinner party, the grand finale wasn't about who could eat the most or drink the fastest. No, it was about how the evening would come to an end and how the guests would depart with grace, their impressions lingering in the air long after they left. Now, as the last course of dessert has been cleared away and the final drops of wine are savored, the host will begin preparing for the closing rituals. There's no quick good night, and thanks for coming. This is a performance, after all. The host stands, perhaps a bit wobbly from the same wine they've been serving all night, and raises a glass. The final toast is made, usually in honor of the monarch, the successful conclusion of the evening, or simply in appreciation of the company present. Everyone around the table echoes the toast, raising their glasses in unison, though the meaning behind the gesture is as much about social obligation as it is about friendship. But here's where things get truly strange. The departure itself was often an event in itself. Guests didn't just gather their things and slip out quietly. No, they were expected to leave with a certain level of grandeur, and often with a gift. This wasn't a casual exchange of a thank you card or a bottle of wine. The gifts were meant to be symbolic of the evening's importance. Some guests might receive a small token, like a piece of fine china, a rare fruit from the host's private orchard, or even a beautifully embroidered handkerchief, all carefully chosen to represent the host's esteem for them. However, historians still argue whether the gifts were truly given out of generosity or if they were part of a calculated effort to ensure future invitations and continued social favor. Either way, it was a time when the art of gift giving was as important as the meal itself, cementing relationships that could last for years or even decades. And while some guests might leave with a little gift tucked under their arm, others were simply swept into the evening's final social ritual, the departure of the servants. After all, the servants were just as much a part of the evening's flow as the guests. They weren't simply there to clean up, they were part of the dinner party's choreography, moving quietly and efficiently throughout the evening. As guests trickle out, the servants begin clearing the tables, collecting the leftover wine, and taking away the remnants of the grand feast. By the time the last guest departs, the dining room is transformed from a space of extravagant excess to one of calm emptiness, with only a few crumbs remaining as evidence of the night's indulgence. For you, as you step out of the dining hall into the night, the cold air hits your face, a sharp contrast to the warmth of the room you've just left. The lights behind you flicker dim as the final conversations fade into the distance. There's something strangely satisfying about the conclusion of a 17th century dinner party. Perhaps it's the knowledge that you've just participated in a deeply ingrained social tradition, one that, while strange and excessive by modern standards, was undoubtedly memorable and carefully constructed. As you make your way through the darkened streets back to your home, you reflect on the evening's spectacle, the extravagant fashion, the unusual food combinations, the endless flow of alcohol, and the theatrics of it all. Everything was designed to make an impression. But in the end, it wasn't the food that mattered most. It was the social experience. The art of dining was more than just a physical act. It was an intricate social dance, a performance that played out in real time, with each guest contributing to the evening's success or failure. And as you settle back into your own bed, perhaps a little tipsy, the night's events replay in your mind. The laughter, the strange conversations, the high society gossip, and the odd delicacies, all of it had one purpose: to make you feel like you had truly participated in something grand. But when all's said and done, the most lasting memory might just be the feeling of camaraderie that came from sharing a meal, however extravagant, with others. The next morning, as the sunlight begins to filter through the curtains, you wake up with a bit of a headache, no doubt a leftover effect of last night's punch. The rich wine, the bold flavors of the meats, and those sugary desserts have left you feeling a little heavy, both in your stomach and in your mind. You sit up in bed, letting the soft morning light gently remind you that the extravagant spectacle of the night before is now a memory, a curious, almost surreal dream that feels a little far removed from the reality of your ordinary life. But as you sit there, reflecting on it all, the question remains: why was so much effort put into making these dinner parties so elaborate? After all, it wasn't about simply gathering people to enjoy a meal, it was about social dominance. The 17th century English dinner party was as much a display of power, wealth, and status as it was about the food itself. And this is where the true quirkiness of these gatherings emerges. They weren't just about sharing a meal or socializing. No, these dinner parties were a tool, a way to assert influence, forge alliances, and secure political and social advantages. At the heart of this excess was the concept of hospitality. In an era where social mobility was limited, the dinner table became the space where relationships were formed, reinforced, and even manipulated. A single dinner party could be a turning point in someone's life, a way to secure a future position, gain favor with the monarch, or impress the right people. But it was also a space where a person's entire reputation was at stake. Every detail, the seating arrangements, the timing of the courses, the way the wine was poured, was carefully planned and executed. The dinner party wasn't just a social event, it was an opportunity to perform, to ensure that every guest left with the understanding that they had just witnessed something grand, something beyond ordinary. As you reflect on this concept of hospitality, you begin to realize that the evening's purpose went beyond even the lavish food or the entertainment. It was all about the careful orchestration of power. The foods might have been exotic, and the toasts might have been frequent, but everything, from the grand entrance to the final farewell, was designed to cement social hierarchies. Those who knew the right people, who could navigate the social intricacies of the evening, would walk away with something more than just a good meal. They would walk away with influence. But what about the guests who weren't at the top of the social ladder? For them, dinner parties were often an opportunity to climb that ladder, even if it meant enduring the oddities of the food or the pressure of staying composed amidst all the opulence. And for the servants, well, their role in these grand feasts often goes unnoticed, but they were just as crucial to the evening's flow. The servants, though part of the lower class, had to perform their duties with the utmost professionalism, ensuring everything ran smoothly. Their position at the dinner table was determined by the host, yet their role in maintaining the spectacle was just as important as the guests themselves. When you consider the servants and the guests together, it's clear that dinner parties were about the careful management of roles, status, and expectations. Guests weren't simply there to eat, they were there to play their parts in a social drama, one that revolved around subtle power plays and carefully constructed performances. And no one, not even the host, was exempt from the pressure to perform. As the memory of the dinner party lingers in your mind, you start to notice something: the quirky rituals, the strange food combinations, and the hours spent talking about everything from art to politics. They all had a singular purpose. The dinner party was about reinforcing the idea that life was a performance, and if you didn't play your part perfectly, you might just find yourself excluded from future invitations. But somehow, despite the heavy social weight of it all, the evening had a certain charm. It was absurd, it was excessive, and yes, it was definitely odd. But it was also a way to connect, to belong, and to enjoy, if only for a brief moment, the experience of sharing in something grand and extraordinary. Now, as you sit there in the calm quiet of the morning, the events of the evening begin to fade into the background. The weight of the feast, the heavy drinking, the grand performances, everything becomes distant, leaving you with a sense of quiet satisfaction. You've experienced something rare, something out of the ordinary. It might have been a bit much, but it was an unforgettable evening filled with eccentricities and oddities that you won't soon forget. As the day unfolds, you begin to realize just how much your perspective on dinner parties, especially those of the 17th century, has shifted. What once seemed like a faraway spectacle now feels almost tangible, like you've had a glimpse into a time where every meal was an opportunity to construct an identity, both personal and social. The more you think about it, the more you start to see that these extravagant dinners weren't just about indulging in excess, they were about telling stories. And in these stories, everyone played a role, from the host down to the last servant who quietly went about their duties behind the scenes. You can almost picture it now, the bustling preparations, the shimmering cutlery laid out meticulously on long tables, the hushed whispers as guests arrived, careful to maintain an air of mystery and elegance. The host, standing tall at the head of the table, overseeing every detail, making sure everything was just so. It wasn't enough to simply enjoy the food. The food had to mean something. Every dish was a performance, each one designed to elicit a reaction, whether it was awe at the exotic meats or confusion over the bizarre combinations of spices. But beyond the meals and the toasts, the stories that unfolded were as much a part of the event as the food itself. Guests didn't just sit frontally and chew their food, they discussed, debated, and performed. Conversations about politics, art, or philosophy would often turn into heated debates, each guest trying to outwit the other in an effort to prove their intellectual superiority. You could almost hear the voices rising in excitement, the jabs of humor, the sharp, pointed remarks flying across the table. But beneath all of that was the understanding that this was, in many ways, a game, a game of position, of status, and of influence. And speaking of influence, let's not forget the curious ways in which these dinner parties often doubled as power plays. As you begin to see the mechanics of this, it becomes clear that they weren't just social gatherings. They were strategic moves in a grand political chess match. It wasn't enough to simply be seen. One had to be seen in the right places, with the right people. Dinner parties became crucial venues for political alliances. Guests might subtly shift their positions at the table, positioning themselves next to influential figures or royal confidants, hoping to form connections that would benefit them in the future. Yet there was a unique beauty in how these gatherings also served as an escape, a brief, albeit opulent, respite from the grind of daily life. For a few hours, the rigid structures of society could melt away, replaced by the grandeur of fine food, fine drink, and the shared experience of something rare and fleeting. You didn't need to be an aristocrat to participate, as long as you knew the right people and played your part. You could find yourself seated at the grand table. That's the magic of these parties, after all. They were about inclusion, whether by wealth, power, or wit. But it was that ever present, subtle pressure to perform that kept things from ever getting too comfortable. If you weren't careful, you could quickly find yourself on the outside looking in. As the day fades into evening again, you reflect on just how much has changed since those days of opulent dining rooms and endless courses. Today, Dinner parties might still be about impressing guests or showcasing culinary skills, but they lack the sheer spectacle and social weight of the 17th century. In our modern world, it's hard to imagine a meal where the food, the conversation, and the seating arrangement were all so carefully designed to assert influence and power. Today, we eat for pleasure, but back then, dinner was a performance, a social event where your entire identity could be shaped in the span of a single meal. But perhaps in the end, it's not the extravagant displays of wealth or the odd food combinations that stand out the most from these gatherings. It's the way these events wove together the fabric of society, shaping relationships, reinforcing status, and creating memories. The elaborate courses and strange entertainment may have faded into history, but the concept of coming together to break bread, to share stories, and to make connections is something that endures. There's something timeless about that act, no matter how much the table settings, the food, or the guests may change over time. And so, as you finish your reflection, you begin to realize that while the 17th century dinner party may have been bizarre in many ways, it was also a reminder of how culture and society shape our lives. A dinner party isn't just about eating, it's about everything else that comes with it: the conversation, the atmosphere, the performances, and, of course, the connections made. It was, at its core, a celebration of humanity's most important instinct: the need to gather together and share, even if it was just for the sake of status or an evening of spectacle. As the evening draws near and you ponder all the little intricacies of 17th century dinner parties, something becomes clear. These gatherings weren't merely about the food or the wine. They were about creating a space for human connection, even if that connection was often masked by layers of opulence and strategy. When you think about it, the very essence of these meals was a social performance, and each guest played a part. There was a subtle beauty in how these performances unfolded, each person dancing through a maze of etiquette, conversation, and dramatic displays of wealth. But now, with the events of last night fading into the past, the most significant question lingers in your mind. How did this all happen? How did the 17th century come to have such a distinct, almost theatrical approach to dining? To answer that, you'll need to take a step back and understand the political and social context of the time. After all, dinner parties didn't exist in a vacuum. They were influenced by the complex dynamics of the period, chief among them the rigid class structures and the emphasis on social hierarchy. You see, during the 17th century, society was divided into distinct classes, and the dinner table served as one of the most important arenas for navigating those divisions. At the very top, you had the aristocracy, the nobility, the wealthy landowners, and the royals, whose influence and power extended beyond the dinner table into nearly every facet of public life. These dinner parties, then, weren't just for fun. They were opportunities to reinforce and display one's social standing. The wealthier the guest, the more they were able to dominate the conversation and the seating arrangements. For those lower down the ladder, attending a dinner party was a way to climb that social ladder, even if the climb was steep. Every meal was a chance to network, to impress, and to form alliances that could be the key to gaining influence. And because status and wealth were so entwined, even the simplest details of a dinner party, the way food was presented, the conversation that unfolded, and the way guests interacted, could signal someone's place in the hierarchy. The contrast between the luxurious feasts enjoyed by the rich and the simpler fare of the lower classes is an important part of understanding the dinner party's significance. The wealthier guests would dine on roasted meats, sweet delicacies, and imported wines. Meanwhile, those at the lower end of the spectrum would eat much more modestly, relying on staples like bread, stew, and ale. But this wasn't just a matter of dietary preference, it was a reflection of social expectations. The lavishness of the dinner party was meant to reinforce the stark divide between the haves and the have nots. Historians still argue whether these social divisions were truly as rigid as they seemed. Some believe that the dinner party, for all its opulence, was an opportunity for guests to engage in a type of cultural exchange, to learn from one another, to challenge norms and ideas. Others contend that it was nothing more than a superficial display, a way to mask the inequalities of the time behind a veil of elegance. Regardless of which side of the debate you fall on, one thing is certain. These dinners were designed to reflect and reinforce the political and social realities of the 17th century. In that context, the oddities of the food, the bizarre entertainment, and the elaborate rituals make perfect sense. The purpose wasn't simply to eat and drink, it was to elevate oneself in the eyes of others. Every morsel of food, every sip of wine, and every toast raised was a calculated move in the grand game of social power. When you understand that, you begin to see the dinner party for what it truly was, a microcosm of the social dynamics of the time, a place where status was continually negotiated, challenged, and reinforced. And then, just as the guests have begun to settle into their seats, you realize that the evening, with all its performances, has a deeper layer that speaks to the nature of human connection itself. Because at the end of the day, no matter how elaborate the meal, no matter how carefully orchestrated the seating arrangement, no matter how ridiculous the games and the entertainment became, the real point of the evening was about gathering together. Beneath the display of wealth and power, there was something deeply human about these dinner parties. It was about connection, about sharing a meal with others, and about the bonds that were formed over shared laughter, conversation, and wine. So, as you settle back into the comfort of your own space, perhaps you begin to feel a quiet sense of satisfaction, because for all the pageantry and excess of the past, the human impulse to share a meal with others hasn't changed. Whether in the 17th century or today, the act of coming together around a table, sharing stories, food, and drink, is still one of the most enduring ways we connect. And perhaps that's the most beautiful takeaway from all of this. No matter how far we've come, there's something timeless and universal about the gathering itself. As the sun begins to dip below the horizon once more, it's hard not to wonder about the lasting impact these grand dinners had on society. It seems strange now, doesn't it? The idea that an evening spent with food, wine, and idle chatter could hold such significance. And yet, for all the oddities of these 17th century dinner parties, the strange food combinations, the elaborate rituals, the theatrical performances, it's clear that they played a crucial role in shaping the social and political landscape of the time. They were more than just indulgences. They were rituals that tied people together, reinforced social hierarchies, and helped navigate the complexities of human interaction. As you begin to wind down, you think about how this world of opulence contrasts with the quieter, more humble meals of today. The elegance of the 17th century dinner table, with its sparkling goblets, towering sugar sculptures, and rich delicacies, seems a world apart from the simplicity of a modern day meal. And yet, in some ways, we're still performing the same basic human act. We gather around a table, share food, and engage in conversation. Perhaps the only difference now is that we're less concerned with the display of wealth and status and more focused on the bonds we create. But still, there's something to be said about how the rituals of the past linger in modern life. When you attend a dinner party today, do you ever wonder if your seating position subtly reflects your status in the group? When you're invited to share a meal, are there not still some unspoken rules and social expectations you feel pressured to follow? Though we may have discarded the grand gestures of yore, like the bizarre multi course feasts and over the top theatrical performances, there's an underlying current of social performance that persists. Take a moment to think about the way dinner parties are conducted today. The seating arrangements might still be a sign of importance, even if the dinner itself is more modest. We still raise our glasses for toasts. We still engage in witty conversation, or at least try to, and we still navigate the delicate balance of politeness and wit, just as guests did centuries ago. Perhaps the most enduring element of these gatherings isn't the food, the music, or even the politics. It's the act of coming together, of marking a moment in time where connections are made, relationships are nurtured, and memories are formed. For all the extravagance of the 17th century feast, at its core, the dinner party was a means of bonding. The table was a place of belonging, a space where people could come together, share their experiences, and reinforce the social structures that governed their world. Today, while we no longer entertain with the same level of grandeur, the core purpose of dining together remains the same. And maybe, in the end, that's why these grand 17th century meals still captivate our imagination, because beneath all the excess and performance, what we're really seeing is a reflection of our own desire to connect, to belong, and to share our lives with others, no matter the era. The more you reflect on it, the more you realize that perhaps the biggest takeaway from these elaborate dinner parties isn't the spectacle itself, but the way those social gatherings reveal the timeless nature of human relationships. People, throughout history, have always sought to connect over meals. Whether it's a simple family dinner or an extravagant banquet, the core idea has remained unchanged. Food is the vehicle for connection, conversation, and community. So, as you let the images of those long, candlelit tables fade away, and the conversations of distant centuries drift into the past, you're left with a quiet sense of continuity. No matter how far back you go, no matter how strange the food or convoluted the rituals, the desire to gather, to eat, and to share remains a constant thread throughout history. The 17th century English dinner party, for all its excess, was ultimately a celebration of that very simple truth. We need one another, and sometimes the best way to show that need is by gathering together around a table where laughter, food, and drink are shared. And so, as you drift off, you find yourself pondering one last thought. Maybe, just maybe, the most quirky part of these dinner parties was the reminder that in the end, they were all about something we still cherish today: human connection. And that, my friend, is something timeless. As the quiet of the night takes over, with nothing but the soft murmur of distant noises in the background, you begin to realize that the 17th century English dinner party wasn't just an event. It was a moment in time when society's most fundamental traits were on full display. The food, the music, the conversation, they were all part of a delicate dance, one that required participants to navigate complex rules, both unspoken and explicit. The evening had a rhythm to it, a flow that was carefully orchestrated, and even though it may seem like a frivolous affair today, it was a symbol of the values that shaped that era: social order, power dynamics, and the art of performance. But as the last glass of wine is drunk and the guests make their exit, the dinner party fades into memory. However, its impact lingers in the minds of those who were there, shaping not just their evening, but their place in the broader social framework. And even though you may never be part of such a gathering, there's something almost universal about the experience of communal dining. The act of coming together, sharing stories, and expressing ideas through food and drink is as ancient as humanity itself, transcending time and place. For a moment, you wonder what it would have been like to sit at that table, to engage in those delicate rituals of conversation, to taste the strange dishes, and to maneuver through the social maelstrom of 17th century England. It's easy to get lost in the spectacle, to imagine yourself surrounded by layers of silk and velvet, the scent of exotic spices hanging in the air. But in the end, what truly stands out is the way these meals served as a bridge between individuals, connecting them through shared experiences, even if only for a fleeting moment. As you lie there, the fading memory of the evening's conversation still echoing in your mind, you can't help but realize that these dinner parties were far more than they seemed. They were not just events, they were subtle expressions of the social contracts that governed people's lives. They were, in their own strange way, a reflection of how humans have always used food as a tool for connection, for sharing, and for asserting power. In this quiet moment, you can't help but admire the odd charm of these gatherings, with all their quirks, their excess, and their peculiarities. The extravagant dishes, the strange combination of flavors, the flamboyant fashion, it was all part of the grand performance, the play that everyone was participating in. Whether they were aware of it or not, every person at that table was playing a role, adhering to the complex social rules of the time, and in doing so, they were preserving a delicate balance that would define their place in society. And now, as the night deepens and you feel the weight of the day slip away, you realize that these strange, extravagant dinners were just photom one part of a much larger story. They were a snapshot of a particular time and place, but they also represented something deeper: the need for connection, the need for community, and the desire to belong. Because no matter the century, no matter the setting, we're all still searching for those same things. We gather around tables, we break bread, we share stories, and in doing so, we carve out moments of meaning in a world that can often feel chaotic and disconnected. So, as you begin to drift off into the calm of the night, the images of those grand, over the top dinner parties start to fade, but you know they won't be forgotten. Because, in a way, those dinner parties were more than just relics of the past. They were reminders of the things that bind us together as human beings. And maybe, just maybe, that's what makes them so timeless. As the darkness envelops the night and the gentle hum of your thoughts fades, you find yourself thinking about the role of food in shaping not just a dinner, but an entire social structure. The 17th century dinner party was a microcosm of society, where every detail, no matter how small, was designed to reinforce the social order. The food was as much a part of that as anything else. The strange meats, the imported spices, the elaborate desserts. These weren't just dishes meant to satiate hunger, they were messages, signals of wealth, power, and culture. You can almost picture the room, the long table stretching from one end to the other, laden with food so extravagant that it felt more like a performance than a meal. The smells would be overpowering, roasted meats mingling with the delicate scent of spices from far off lands. The richness of sugared desserts is filling the air. And yet, behind the fragrant haze, the underlying message was clear. The dinner party was a space for social exchange, a place where individuals could assert their status while also connecting with one another. But here's the thing, the most interesting part about these grand dinners isn't the food itself, it's the act of sharing it. The entire event was an exchange of ideas, stories, and, yes, status. The social rules at the dinner table were so intricate that they required guests to be not only so well mannered, but also exceptionally aware of their position in the room. The host was always at the head of the table, but the guests were also carefully arranged. Those with the most power and influence sat closest, while those lower down the social ladder were placed further away. The fact that food was used as a social tool makes it fascinating. It wasn't about nourishing the body, but rather about nourishing the ego, the relationships, and the reputations of everyone involved. Think about it. The exotic dishes served at these gatherings weren't just there to impress, they were symbols of the host's ability to procure rare ingredients and serve them in a way that spoke to their wealth and taste. The guests, too, weren't simply there to enjoy the meal, they were there to be seen, to engage in conversation that reinforced their own importance, to subtly assert their place in the social hierarchy. But what happens when you strip away the spectacle of the dinner party, the long tables, the rich food, the elaborate toasts, and focus solely on the human connections that were forged around that table? What you're left with is something far more meaningful than any political alliance or display of wealth, the fundamental human need to connect. No matter how grand or how humble the meal, the act of sharing food and conversation has always been about coming together. It's about creating bonds, building relationships, and affirming our shared humanity. And so, as you let the memory of last night's grand spectacle settle into the background, you begin to see the dinner party for what it truly was, a ritual that, while extravagant in its execution, was ultimately about connection. The rules, the food, the social hierarchy, they were all part of a performance, yes, but they were also tools that allowed people to come together, even if just for a few hours. They offered an opportunity to affirm one's place in the world, to build relationships, and to share in the simple yet profound joy of eating and being seen. You drift deeper into your thoughts, and the image of that long, candlelit table starts to feel less distant, more intimate. The laughter, the clinking of goblets, the long discussions about art, politics, and philosophy, these moments were the ones that truly mattered. And when you think about it, perhaps that's why these dinner parties still captivate our imaginations today. They were more than just lavish spectacles, they were reflections of the complex ways in which we connect, communicate, and relate to one another. As the night grows quieter, you let the memory of the evening slowly fade, knowing that while the 17th century dinner party may be a thing of the past, the human impulse to gather and connect remains as strong as ever. In the end, the most enduring part of these events wasn't the food, the drink, or even the grand performances. It was the simple, timeless act of sitting down together and sharing a meal. As the quiet of the night settles in, you find yourself reflecting on something else, something deeper beneath the surface of those lavish 17th century dinners. Yes, the food was excessive, the performances grand, and the social dances intricate. But all of that excess had a purpose. It wasn't just about indulgence or showing off. It was a ritual, one that, despite its extravagance, mirrored the human need for belonging and connection. These grand dinner parties were like a stage, and everyone involved played their part, whether consciously or not. And when you take a step back, you begin to realize that this concept isn't all that foreign to us today. Sure, we don't dine on peacock stuffed pies or sip wine mixed with spices from distant lands, but we still gather, we still share food, still engage in conversation, still use the act of eating as a vehicle for socializing. It's just that the context has changed. Instead of grand balls and massive feasts, we have dinner parties that are perhaps a little more modest, but no less significant. Think about the last time you shared a meal with friends or family. What did that meal represent? Perhaps it was an excuse to get together, to break away from the grind of daily life, to catch up with those we care about. And yet, even in these seemingly simple moments, there's an unspoken ritual at play. Whether it's the way we set the table, the food we choose to prepare, or the way we pour the wine, there's still a performance happening. It's not about wealth or power anymore, but about connection. Sharing a meal is an expression of intimacy, a chance to bond, to strengthen ties, and to show care. The more you think about it, the more you realize that human connection has always been at the heart of it all. Sure, in the 17th century, food was used to display wealth and status. But today, food is often a means of creating something else, something more personal. Meals are a way of showing love, of offering a piece of ourselves to others. You don't have to serve extravagant dishes or flaunt rare wines to create a memorable meal. All you need is the desire to connect, to share, and to enjoy one another's company. In fact, it's interesting to consider how the passage of time has shifted our approach to these gatherings. The grandiosity of 17th century dinner parties has given way to simpler, more intimate affairs. People today still place emphasis on the experience, but now the focus tends to be more on the people gathered around the table than on the display of wealth or opulence. It's about the atmosphere, the laughter, the shared stories, the comfort of being together without the weight of performance. But no matter how humble or grand the meal may be, one thing has remained constant through time: the desire to belong. Whether it's in a formal banquet hall or around a cozy kitchen table, the need to connect with others over food is something deeply ingrained in us. It's a primal instinct, one that transcends time and place. As the night grows deeper and you start to feel the comforting heaviness of sleep creeping in, you can't help but think about the lasting impact these dinner parties had on the way we connect. The 17th century dinner party, with all its quirks and eccentricities, wasn't just a reflection of the time period, it was a reflection of us, of our need to come together, to share, to celebrate our common humanity. These grand meals, extravagant as they were simply a manifestation of something much older, much deeper: the desire to bond, to build relationships, and to celebrate the simple joy of eating together. And now, as the images of those long, opulent tables fade, you start to realize that the essence of those gatherings still exists. We may not dress in velvet coats or eat peacock stuffed pies, but the human need for connection remains as strong as ever. Whether we're sharing a meal with family or a quiet dinner with a friend, the ritual is the same. Food is our medium, and connection is our goal. And with that thought, as you drift off to sleep, you realize something comforting: that no matter how much time passes, no matter how much society changes, the act of coming together over food will always be a part of who we are. The next morning, as the world outside wakes with the soft rustle of a new day, you can't help but carry with you the feeling of quiet reflection. Last night's dinner parties and their layers of spectacle seem like a distant dream, but they continue to resonate in your thoughts. It's funny, isn't it? How something as seemingly trivial as a meal with its elaborate rituals can echo through time, influencing the way we live today. The 17th century dinner party wasn't merely about what was served or how guests behaved. It was about creating an experience that transcended the moment, leaving behind traces that would be felt for generations. In the quiet moments of your morning routine, the thought of those grand dinners and their intricacies now feels less like a historical curiosity and more like a thread in the tapestry of human behavior. For all the pretensions of wealth and status, the true magic of these gatherings wasn't in the exotic dishes or the dazzling array of drinks. It was in the connection. The food may have been extravagant, but the fundamental human need for companionship, community, and belonging was at the heart of it all. As you sip your coffee, the grand spectacle of those dinners fades, and what remains is a simple truth. We still gather around tables today, just as they did centuries ago. The setting might have changed, the foods might be different, and the rituals more relaxed, but the desire to connect over a shared meal is timeless. In a way, the essence of those long, extravagant dinners is alive in our modern gatherings, albeit in a more subdued form. You think about the last time you shared a meal, perhaps with close friends or family. You probably didn't worry about the political ramifications of your seating choice, or whether your drink was spiced with rare cinnamon from India, but you were, in your own way, participating in the same ritual. The conversations, the shared laughter, the offering of food, it's all part of the same fundamental desire to connect, just as it was centuries ago. Whether we're breaking bread over a simple meal or indulging in a more extravagant feast, the act of sharing food remains a deeply human experience. And maybe that's the most profound takeaway from all this, a realization that even in an age of high tech everything, when social interactions can happen over text or video, there's something irreplaceable about sitting down together to share a meal. It's in the eye contact, the shared jokes, the momentary silences filled only by the clink of cutlery and the passing of dishes. The 17th century dinner party, with all its complexities and excess, was merely one form of this ancient human practice, and while the details may have evolved, the heart of it remains unchanged. As you let that thought settle into your mind, you start to see the deeper connection between the past and present. Dinner parties, whether lavish or modest, reflect the same human truths: our need to gather, to share, to communicate. The 17th century might have been about demonstrating wealth, but in a way, it was also about expressing care, about using food as a medium to connect with others. In fact, the socializing that took place around those long tables might have had more to do with human connection than we often realize. Now, as the morning stretches into the day, you feel a renewed sense of appreciation for the simple act of sharing meals. Maybe it's not about the spectacle or the political machinations behind the seating arrangements or the rare spices on the table. Maybe it's just about those moments when you sit across from another person, break bread together, and feel that quiet, essential connection. No matter the time or place, those moments carry a certain magic. And as you head into your day, a lingering thought stays with you: how even in our most ordinary meals, we're still performing that timeless ritual, still finding ways to connect, just as people did centuries ago. The traditions, the quirks, the grandeur may fade, but the fundamental desire to bond, to eat together, and to share experiences remains as vital and meaningful as ever. As the day unfolds and you begin to lose yourself in the rhythms of your own life, something subtle but powerful begins to take root: the realization that those long, lavish dinner parties of the past, filled with opulence and theatricality, were not just remnants of history, they were part of an ongoing conversation. The spectacle, the extravagant foods, the endless wine, and the careful placement of guests at the table, all these layers were not just about display. They were about communication. They were about ensuring that everyone present felt both important and connected, even in their own subtle ways. The deeper you think about it, the more you understand that these dinners were not just social gatherings. They were calculated efforts to bring people together, even when that togetherness was built on a foundation of power and status. But even within that structure, there was something undeniably human about them. The shared act of eating, of sitting together and exchanging stories, transcended the politics of the evening. No matter how much the hosts worked to ensure the evening was about impressing others, There was an undeniable sense that the act of sharing a meal had its own power to transform, power to heal, power to unite. In a world where communication often takes place through screens, where meals are hurried and sometimes eaten alone, it's easy to forget the ancient, almost sacred role of shared dining. Meals in the 17th century, much like meals today, were about connection. Perhaps the food was less about nourishment and more about performing a role in a carefully choreographed evening. But the real power of those gatherings lay in the shared experience of being together. The conversation, the laughter, the quiet moments of contemplation, these were what truly defined the night. As you think about your own meals, you may realize that there's more to them than you once thought. Meals don't just fill our stomachs, they create space for something more profound. A shared meal is an opportunity to bond, to laugh, to tell stories, and to open ourselves to the experiences of others. It's an act that transcends the physical need for food. In many ways, a dinner party today might be simpler than the extravagant feasts of centuries past, but the core of it is the same. The human need to come together, to connect, is universal. You might find yourself reflecting on the quieter moments of your own life, those dinner conversations where the world outside seemed to melt away. Whether it was a family dinner or a catch up with friends, the table has always been a place where connection is forged. And in a strange way, even the simplest of meals has a little bit of that 17th century magic. The connections made around a table, whether during a humble dinner at home or an extravagant banquet, are what make those moments unforgettable. So as you move through the rest of the day, there's a lingering warmth from these thoughts, a soft reminder of how timeless the simple act of sharing food truly is. It may look different now. We may no longer don velvet coats or serve peacock pies, but the core of it is the same. We gather, we eat, we connect, and in doing so, we write the ongoing story of our shared humanity. By the time the evening rolls in again, with the light fading gently from the sky, you begin to realize that dinner parties, however grand or humble, are more than mere social occasions. They are human rituals, small, everyday celebrations of connection that carry us through time. And perhaps, as the sun sets once more, you feel a little more aware of the power of these moments. The joy of sitting down with others to eat, to share, to connect. It's the thread that runs through history and binds us together century after century. As you move through the days that follow, the thoughts of those 17th century dinner parties continue to drift in and out of your mind. In a way, they've become more than just a curiosity of the past. They've become a reminder of something deeper, something often overlooked in our fast paced modern lives. The true value of connection. The image of that long, candle-lit table with all its finery isn't just a picture of excess. It's a reflection of the lengths people go to in order to foster relationships, to share stories, and to participate in a ritual as old as civilization itself. It's a reminder that dining together, no matter how extravagant or modest, is not just about food, it's about people. As you reflect more on it, the idea of food as a bridge between people begins to feel like the most natural thing in the world. In fact, It's almost surprising how little has changed. Yes, the context is different now, and the grand banquets have turned into simpler meals. But the core idea that food brings us together, that it creates a space for conversation, laughter, and sometimes even silence, has endured. Perhaps this is the one thing that remains timeless about the dinner party, its power to bring people into one shared experience, to create a fleeting moment of community. And as you continue to move through your routine, a subtle shift begins to take place in your thinking. You start to see the connections between the past and the present more clearly. Sure, the 17th century dinner party was all about power, wealth, and showing off one's status, but beneath that layer, there was something else, a deeply human need to bond, to share, and to be seen. As extravagant as those gatherings were, they still reflected the basic human impulse to connect. The desire to gather around a table to break bread with others is as primal as it gets. The more you think about it, the more you begin to notice these gatherings in your own life. Maybe it's not the grand spectacle of a royal banquet, but the simple, quiet dinners with friends or family. Maybe it's the comfort of a home cooked meal or the joy of sharing a drink with a loved one. And in these moments, you realize that you're still participating in that ancient tradition of coming together over food. It might look different now, and perhaps the power dynamics aren't quite as intense as they were back in the 17th century. But the essence of it, the need for connection, the desire to share, remains unchanged. These realizations, though subtle, start to shift your perspective on the small moments in life. How many times have you rushed through a meal, barely paying attention to the people around you, distracted by the busyness of your day? The next time you sit down for a meal, whether it's with friends or family, you may find yourself slowing down just a bit more, savoring the conversation, the food, and the connection. You may even think back to those long tables from centuries past and realize that, in your own way, you're participating in the same kind of social ritual, one that is just as old, just as important as it ever was. There's a new sense of gratitude that comes with this understanding. Perhaps you'll find yourself cherishing your next dinner with a deeper sense of meaning. It's not about the grandeur, the complexity of the meal, or the number of courses. It's about the people you share it with, the stories that unfold around the table, and the quiet moments that fill the space in between bites. And maybe that's the true magic of it all. These meals, however simple, are more than just nourishment. They are opportunities to create memories, to strengthen bonds, and to share in the essential human experience of connection. As you let that thought settle, a peaceful calm comes over you. The echoes of the grand 17th century dinners may have faded from your mind, but their deeper significance remains. It's not the extravagant displays that resonate most, it's the simplicity beneath it all. And in the quiet moments, as you share a meal with others, you realize that you're still part of this timeless ritual. The table may have changed, the dishes may be simpler, but the need to gather, to share, and to connect is eternal. As the days move forward, you find yourself carrying this new perspective with you. There's something grounding about it, this understanding of the profound role food plays in our relationships. You might not be seated at a grand, velvet draped table, but the simple act of breaking bread with others holds more weight than it once did. As you reflect, you begin to see how easily the act of sharing a meal has become something we overlook, something we rush through, yet it's still one of the most powerful ways to connect with others. Whether it's a quiet dinner at home or a bustling gathering, there's magic in these moments that we often take for granted. In thinking about the grand dinners of centuries past, it's hard to ignore the ways in which the spectacle of it all feels distant from us today. The layered performances, the extravagant dishes, the display of wealth, it all seems a bit over the top, perhaps even irrelevant to our more modest meals. But in some way, you understand why those displays were so important back then. For all the drama, for all the layers of pomp, these dinners were simply reflections of an underlying desire to belong, to create relationships, to bond. When you think of it like that, those grand 17th century feasts begin to seem a little less excessive and a little more relatable. They were just grand expressions of a deeply human need, one that transcends time and place. In our world today, we may not have to go to such extremes to build connections, but we still have that same deep need to be understood, to feel included, and to share our stories with others. In a way, every dinner, no matter how simple, is an opportunity to reaffirm our place in the world, to invite others into our lives, and to reinforce the bonds that hold us together. And so, as you go through your daily life, you begin to see the quiet beauty in the everyday meals you share. It's in the laughter exchanged over a Sunday roast, the conversations that flow over glasses of wine, the comfort of a meal shared with family or close friends. These are the moments that matter, the moments that keep the thread of connection alive. The grand, opulent dinners of the 17th century may be gone, but the essence of those gatherings, the act of bringing people together, still lives on in every meal shared, no matter how humble. You start to notice these moments more often now, appreciating them for what they are. Perhaps it's the quiet conversation after a long day, the easy comfort of a well prepared dish, or the feeling of camaraderie as everyone digs in, laughing and sharing their thoughts. You realize that these moments, though smaller in scale than those grand banquets of the past, are just as meaningful. They carry with them that same powerful potential for connection. It's about the people at the table, the laughter, the quiet exchanges, and the simple joy of being together. And with that realization, there comes a sense of peace. Maybe the 17th century dinner party was over the top in its extravagance, but its purpose remains just as relevant today. The art of gathering, of creating a space where people can connect, feel seen, and share a part of themselves, that's the real magic of the meal. The dinner party, with all its formality and flourish, was ultimately about coming together. And so, in the end, it doesn't really matter whether you're seated at a grand banquet table or a small kitchen table, you're still part of something timeless. You're part of the story of human connection. As the days pass and you reflect on the past, the memory of those grand dinners, their elegance and excess, seem almost like a distant dream now. But in that dream, there's a thread that stretches into the present. We continue to gather, to share meals, to tell our stories, and in doing so, We keep alive the most important tradition of all, the simple, profound need to be together. With each passing day, you begin to realize that the idea of gathering around the table to share a meal has quietly woven its way into the fabric of your daily life. In fact, now that you're more aware of its significance, the moments spent over a meal become richer, more layered. Maybe it's not the grand banquets of the 17th century that intrigue you now, but the subtle beauty of an evening meal with close friends, or perhaps a quiet Sunday dinner with family. Those simple moments, which once seemed like routine or obligation, now feel like something deeper, an unspoken ritual that connects you with the past and with those around you. The idea of food as a medium for connection feels almost universal. You can see it now, how each meal serves as a thread that weaves you closer to others. Think about it. Whether it's a birthday dinner, a casual lunch with a friend, or a celebratory feast, food has a unique way of bringing people together. It encourages us to slow down, to step away from our individual worlds and share in the collective experience. Food invites conversation, it invites connection, and even more so, it invites vulnerability, the willingness to share, to be open, to let down the walls we sometimes build around ourselves. In thinking about the social intricacies of those grand dinner parties of the 17th century, it's easy to focus on the extravagance, the opulence, and the rules of etiquette. But now, with a more grounded perspective, you see that it wasn't the grandeur that made those gatherings important. It was the purpose behind them. The 17th century dinner party was a celebration of human connection, a place where people came together, not just to eat, but to assert their identities, form alliances, and, perhaps most importantly, to share a moment in time. The food, the wine, the laughter, it was all part of a shared experience that would linger in the memory long after the guests had gone home. And in that sense, it feels like nothing has really changed. Sure, the world is different now. We don't dine with kings and queens, and our tables aren't filled with exotic delicacies or sculpted sugar art. But the essence remains the same. When we gather around the table today, we're still partaking in the same basic human tradition, connecting over food, bonding over shared stories, reinforcing relationships. Even the most modest meal has the power to create an experience that goes beyond just nourishment. It becomes a space for connection, for understanding, for communication. As you continue to embrace this realization, something within you shifts. You find yourself looking at the simple act of sharing a meal with a new sense of appreciation. The next time you're sitting around a table with friends or family, you might notice it more, the way the conversation flows effortlessly, the way everyone seems to open up in a way that feels both natural and comforting. You begin to recognize how even these small, seemingly ordinary moments have the potential to shape relationships, to foster bonds, and to create memories. These moments, these quiet exchanges over food, are the ones that often have the most lasting impact. It's interesting, too, how food, despite its simple nature, still carries so much power. We use it to mark milestones, to celebrate achievements, to comfort one another in times of need. It's a language all its own, one that transcends words. A shared meal doesn't need speeches or elaborate toasts to be meaningful. It simply requires people who are willing to sit down, to share, and to be present with one another. That's all it takes. The rest is just the magic that unfolds when you let yourself be part of the moment. As you reflect on these thoughts, a quiet sense of contentment settles over you. The grand dinners of the past may be a thing of history, but the essence of those gatherings remains alive in every meal shared with others. Whether it's a simple dinner with a few close friends or a more elaborate celebration, it's the same underlying connection that makes these moments special. You don't need to wear a velvet coat or serve peacock pies to experience the magic of a shared meal. All you need is the willingness to gather, to share, and to connect. As time moves on, the lessons of those 17th century dinner parties continue to echo in the back of your mind, like soft ripples in water that stretch further than you first expected. The more you think about it, the more you realize how deeply ingrained this ritual of dining together is in the human experience. It's in the way we gather for birthdays, holidays, or even just a regular Tuesday night dinner. There's something universal about it, the desire to come together, to share a space, a meal, and a moment. And while the world changes around us, this practice remains remarkably steady. As you go about your daily routine, you start to notice how often food is a part of life's milestones. Weddings, graduations, births, these are all marked with shared meals. It doesn't matter if the meal is humble or extravagant. What matters is that it's shared. And just like those 17th century banquets, the meal serves as more than just sustenance. It's a symbol of celebration, of solidarity, of human connection. You start to see how food binds people together, like invisible threads weaving through the fabric of society. Think about the last time you attended a dinner or a party, how the act of sitting down to eat opened the door for conversation, for bonding. There's something about the shared act of eating that brings out the best in people, encouraging them to relax, to engage, to share their thoughts, dreams, and even their secrets. The simple act of passing a dish across the table can break down barriers, transforming strangers into acquaintances and acquaintances into friends. Even in the smallest, most intimate gatherings, you can feel the power of food as a connector. Maybe it's a quiet dinner with your partner, the two of you sitting side by side, enjoying each other's company as much as the meal. Or perhaps it's a weekend brunch with friends, laughter spilling across the table as everyone discusses the events of the week. In these moments, it's easy to forget how much has changed since those grand 17th century dinners, but when you really think about it, they haven't changed all that much. The essence is the same. Food is still the glue that binds us. It's almost as if those lavish dinners were simply a mirror to the human condition. The richness of the meal was secondary to the relationships formed around the table. After all, no matter how extravagant the feast, the true beauty lay in the moments of connection that took place between the courses, between the clinking of glasses and the passing of plates. It's that quiet intimacy, the exchange of stories, the shared laughter, the shared vulnerability that has made the dinner table such a sacred space throughout history. And in this light, you start to appreciate something deeply personal, The way your own dinners reflect this ancient tradition. They don't need to be ornate or filled with rare ingredients, they just need to be shared. A bowl of soup, a loaf of bread, a piece of fruit. They all hold the same magic when shared with the right people. You begin to see the richness not in the food itself, but in the people around on the table. It's about the conversations, the relationships, the warmth of the moment. That's where the magic lies, both now and in the days of those elaborate banquets. As you think back to those grand 17th century gatherings, you realize they were more than just a display of wealth and social power. They were an embodiment of something essential to human nature: the desire to be seen, to connect, to share. We still do it today in small ways with every meal we share with others. And as you sit down for a simple dinner, you can't help but feel a quiet connection to those who came before you: the hosts, the guests, the people who, like you, used food as a way to bridge the gap between souls. There's something timeless about the act of coming together around a table. It's a practice that transcends culture, geography, and time. From ancient feasts to modern dinners, it remains one of the most human things we do: breaking bread together, sharing a meal, and in the process, sharing a part of ourselves. As you move through the day and the world hums around you, the echoes of the past continue to linger, gently guiding your thoughts back to the heart of this timeless ritual: the shared meal. The more you reflect on those 17th century dinners, the more you see how deeply food is interwoven with the fabric of human connection. Whether it was the extravagant feasts of royalty or the quiet gatherings in small, humble homes, food has always been a means of connecting people. And even now, though our meals have become simpler, that same powerful force of togetherness continues to shape our experiences. It's fascinating, really, when you think about the different ways we use food to mark the significant moments in our lives. In some cultures, food is seen as a literal representation of care and love, a way to nourish not only the body, but also the soul. The idea of breaking bread together has been a cornerstone of human connection for centuries, and while the feasts may look different today, the act of gathering and sharing a meal remains just as profound. When you look at it from this angle, those lavish banquets of the past don't seem so far removed from the dinner table you sit at now. The grandeur of the 17th century feast was just one form of that shared experience, one that sought to bring people together in a space of community, however dramatic or extravagant the setting. Now, in our fast paced, often fragmented world, we've begun to lose touch with the power of these moments. How often do we sit down to a meal, distracted by screens, thinking about what comes next or what we have to do tomorrow? We rush through meals, eat on the go, and forget that the act of sitting down together, truly sitting down, has the potential to be one of the most powerful ways we can connect with others. As you reflect on this, you start to see how easy it is to take these moments for granted. We've traded the grand spectacle of the past for convenience, but the essence remains the same. Food is a catalyst for connection. Imagine the next time you sit down with others, you intentionally slow down the pace. Instead of rushing through your meal, you pause. You take the time to notice the conversation unfolding around you. You savor not only the food, but also the company. In doing so, you bring something back from those grand dinners of centuries past, the deliberate act of sharing, of being fully present with the people around you. In a world that's always moving, those small, mindful moments of connection become something worth cherishing. Even in the simplest meal, there is power. A quick lunch with a colleague, a dinner with your family, a picnic with friends. These moments, while often mundane in our day to day lives, are still part of that same human tradition. Just as the 17th century hosts carefully orchestrated their banquets, you too can create a space where connection happens, where conversation flows, and where bonds are deepened. It doesn't require fine china or imported wine. It requires something far more valuable, your presence. And when you think about it, it's in these small moments, those shared, quiet meals, that the greatest connections are often made. The laughter that bubbles up, the stories that are exchanged, the comfort of knowing you belong in that space. It's in these seemingly ordinary moments that the most extraordinary connections are formed. The grand dinners of the past may have been designed to impress, to showcase wealth and status, but they were also about something much simpler and more profound. They were about relationships, building, nurturing, and maintaining them. So, as you continue on with your day, you feel a renewed sense of gratitude for those small, shared moments. Every meal is an opportunity to create something meaningful. It's a chance to slow down, to engage with the people you care about, and to share not just food, but a piece of yourself. And in a world that often moves too fast, these moments of connection become even more precious. There's a certain beauty in this realization, isn't there? The most lavish dinner parties in history may have been grand displays, but the real magic was always in the connections that were made. And those connections, though they may look different now, are still the same. They still happen every day. In every meal shared, we still gather, still break bread together, and still create relationships that nourish our souls. As time slips by, the deeper significance of shared meals continues to resonate with you. Those 17th century dinners, with all their grandeur and extravagance, were merely a reflection of something far older than the fashion of the time. They were a reminder of the importance of gathering, the deep rooted human desire to connect over food. But beyond the outward displays of wealth and status, these day dinners were anchored in a common experience, eating together, sharing stories, and above all, being present with one another. And now, even in our world of modern conveniences, the same core of human connection remains. You begin to notice how much we still rely on food as a way to communicate, even when the social rituals around it have changed. Think about the dinners you've shared with friends or family. These aren't just about filling up, they're about sharing experiences. They're about sitting down together after a long day and finding comfort in each other's company. You realize that food, though it can be extravagant or simple, is always a vessel for something deeper, connection. Maybe it's in the way a friend brings over a homemade dish when you're feeling down, or the way you invite someone to your house, not just to feed them, but to offer them a place at your table. These small gestures are the modern day equivalents of those carefully arranged 17th century banquets. We may not serve swan or peacock pies anymore, but the underlying principle is the same. Food is a gift. It's a way to show care, to invite others into our world, and to create a space for intimacy, laughter, and vulnerability. And just like those guests in the 17th century who relied on these grand dinners to form bonds, we too build relationships through the meals we share. Whether it's a formal dinner party or a casual meal, we use food as a way to communicate how we feel, what we value, and who we want to share our lives with. The act of cooking for someone, or even just sitting down to eat with them, carries a message of care and connection that words alone can't convey. In fact, the more you think about it, the more you realize that these shared moments around the table are some of the most significant experiences we have. In a world that's increasingly driven by technology and disconnected interactions, sitting down with others for a meal forces us to slow down and engage. We can't hide behind screens or busy schedules. We have to be present. And perhaps that's why these moments stand out so clearly in our memories. They're some of the few times we truly give ourselves over to connection. In this quiet reflection, you begin to appreciate the everyday dinners, the small, humble meals, as much as the grand, elaborate feasts. It's not about the extravagance of the food or the opulence of the setting. It's about the people, the conversation, and the shared experience. Whether you're sitting down with family for a simple weeknight meal or gathering with friends for a holiday feast, these are the moments that hold the most value. They are where relationships are built, nurtured, and celebrated. It's easy to forget that these seemingly mundane meals are, in fact, profound. They are rituals in their own right, spaces where we pause, where we step away from the noise of life and simply share. And as you realize this, you begin to see these moments differently. The next time you sit down for a meal, you won't just think about the food on your plate. You'll think about the connection, the laughter, the stories shared, and the feeling of being fully present with the people around you. The realization comes slowly but profoundly. The dinners of the past may have been lavish, but the beauty of a shared meal has always been about the connections it creates, the bonds it strengthens, and the way it brings people together. And in that, you feel a sense of peace, a quiet appreciation for the simple, timeless act of sharing food and company. As you reflect on these quiet revelations, something else starts to settle into your mind, a deeper appreciation for the value of the present moment. So often, we rush through our days, focusing on the next task, the next meeting, the next thing we need to accomplish. But when you pause and think about those meals shared around the table, it's clear that the moments that truly matter aren't the ones filled with distractions or deadlines. They're the ones spent in the company of others, savoring a shared experience. And here's where you begin to notice the beauty of contrast. The 17th century dinner parties, while luxurious and extravagant, were not as dissimilar from today's intimate gatherings as they may first appear. Yes, the hosts and guests of those grand feasts may have been concerned with the politics of social status, wealth, and influence, but underneath it all, they were also participating in something universal, something that transcends time and place, the desire to be seen, to connect, to share. The same human impulses that drove the magnificence of those feasts are still at play today. They've just taken a quieter, more humble form. Now, as you find yourself moving through life, you begin to cherish these small moments more deeply. Every meal shared with loved ones, whether it's a family dinner, a casual brunch, or even a meal on the go with a friend, holds weight. These are the moments that bind us together. Even if the meal is simple, maybe just a bowl of soup or a sandwich, what matters is the act of sharing, of connecting. It's in these moments that we're reminded of what it means to be human, to be part of something larger than ourselves. You begin to see that the true essence of a meal isn't in the food itself, it's in the act of sharing that food with others. Whether it's passing a dish across the table or offering someone a bite of your meal, food becomes a medium for exchange, a way to share not just nourishment, but care, conversation, and companionship. The 17th century dinner parties may have been elaborate, but the fundamental truth behind them remains unchanged. A meal shared is a gesture of togetherness. This realization isn't just comforting, it's also empowering. The next time you sit down for a meal with someone, you'll remember the deeper meaning behind that simple act. You'll be more present, more aware of the connection being created, and you'll begin to savor not just the food, but the exchange of experiences, the conversations, and the shared memories. Because it's not just the grand celebrations that matter, it's these everyday moments, these quiet acts of connection that ultimately shape our relationships and our lives. In fact, as you continue to move through your day, you start to notice the opportunities for connection that arise more naturally. Maybe it's a quick lunch with a colleague, a dinner shared with family, or even a coffee date with a friend. All of these moments, though small, hold incredible potential for meaning, and perhaps that's why you find yourself appreciating them so much more. The world moves quickly, but in these shared meals, there's a chance to slow down, to savor, and to connect. Now, when you think back to those 17th century dinners, you realize that the lavish displays and the carefully orchestrated events weren't the only things that mattered. What truly mattered were the connections that were made over those elaborate meals. And in that sense, perhaps the greatest lesson those dinners have to offer is one of simplicity. It's not the spectacle that makes a meal significant, it's the relationships it nurtures and the memories it creates. As you near the end of this journey through history, you come to appreciate just how timeless the ritual of dining together truly is. From the grand 17th century feasts to the quiet dinners of today, the essence remains unchanged. These meals, simple or extravagant, are all part of a larger human story, a story of connection, sharing, and belonging. The idea that food can serve as a bridge between people, bringing them together across time, space, and social divides, is perhaps the most enduring truth. And as you reflect on it all, you begin to see that these dinner parties, once a symbol of wealth and political maneuvering, were at their core no different from the humble gatherings we have today. Sure, the details were different: the lavish decor, the towering dishes, the carefully placed guests, but the underlying intention was the same: to connect, to bond, to celebrate the shared experience of being together. Those grand feasts were not merely about wealth, they were about relationship. And the same can be said of every dinner we share today. You start to recognize that this ritual is far from an ancient relic. It's still alive in every meal, in every conversation, in every quiet moment spent at the table. When we sit down with others, we're continuing that same tradition of connection. We're participating in a centuries old ritual that transcends time, reminding us that we're all part of a shared human experience. The people who dined in those grand halls centuries ago were seeking the same things we seek now: meaning, connection, and community. And though their world may have been different, the human impulse to share, to gather, and to bond over food remains unchanged. Now, as the day fades into night, you let this truth settle in, allowing it to envelop you in a quiet sense of peace. The beauty of the 17th century dinner party wasn't in its spectacle, it was in its purpose. And that purpose is just as relevant today. The grandeur may be gone, but the connections are still being made every day, every meal, and every gathering. The true essence of the dinner party, whether it's shared over a grand banquet or a simple meal with family, is the connection, the human element that binds us all. As you reflect on these shared moments, you begin to feel a deep gratitude for the simple act of coming together. It's not the complexity of the meal or the extravagance of the setting that matters. It's the people you share it with. It's the stories you tell, the laughter you share, and the memories you create. And as you feel yourself slowly drifting into sleep, you realize that the ritual of gathering around the table, whether in the grand halls of the past or in the quiet intimacy of today, is one of life's most precious gifts. So, as the night falls quiet around you, you can rest in the knowledge that, no matter how much time passes, the human need to connect over food will always endure. It's a tradition that spans centuries, transcends cultures, and remains at the very heart of who we are. And in that, there's comfort, there's peace,